Welcome to this IISS discussion meeting on exploring regime resilience in Damascus. I'm Mark Fitzpatrick, the director of the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Program here at the Institute. You might wonder what this subject has to do with my program on non-proliferation and disarmament. Well, there's the chemical weapons issue, of course. That alone would make it relevant, but there are a couple of other things. The first of our speakers today, Dr. Ibrahim Al-Marashi, has a position as an adjunct scholar at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at the Monterey Institute of International Studies in California. It was through that institute that we came to know each other a couple of years ago. And he's going to be, in his presentation, commenting on the situation in Syria, partly through a perspective of what happened in neighboring Iraq and the issues surrounding its WMD program. So it's very relevant to non-proliferation. The third relevance is that my colleague in the non-proliferation and disarmament program, Dina Esfandiari, sitting in the back, approaches her research through a regional focus, and so issues relating to relations among the countries in the region and the internal dynamics are also part of her research focus. And lastly, all the IISS Middle East experts are elsewhere. Most of them are based in our Middle East office in Manama, Bahrain. One of them is in our Washington office, and then Toby Dodge, who is our premier expert on Iraq, is in Boston today. So I'm not just filling in. I'm doing this on my own volition. So let me ask Dr. Al-Marashi to kick off the discussion. As I say, he's with the Monterey Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. He's also an assistant professor of Middle East history at California State University, San Marcos. He's got a PhD in history from Oxford University. He's published widely on Middle East issues in both academic journals and in media. We see him in the London Times and the New York Times, and he's been invited by several governments to present his research on the lessons of Iraq for Syria. So, Ibrahim, if you could get us started.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for having me, as well as Dina and IISS for sponsoring this talk. For those of you who are unfamiliar with my research, you might have heard of my research in another context, otherwise known as, in, I think, UK parlance, the Dodgy Dossier, which was a report I had written in 2003, and just to make a long story short, was plagiarized by the UK government, used in the run-up to the war. But what was the Dodgy Dossier, or that research I was using up until that time, was essentially to answer a question. It was a dissection of, let's say, the Mukhabarat state, as I would term it, in Iraq. And what lessons did the Mukhabarat state have for regime resilience? In other words, the question I wanted to ask was, how did Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, how did its rule manage to maintain itself? How was it able to stay in power for so long? Okay. And the kind of formula I found in researching Iraq was quite similar that I see when applied to Syria as well, in that we see that the government in Iraq and Syria has kind of a delicate system that plays upon a certain number of security agencies, paramilitary groups, and an elite group. Okay. So having said that, taking that approach to the research I did on Iraq, and now I'm applying it to Syria, what I'm trying to do is combine the documents that were eventually captured from Iraq, having read thousands of those documents, and then see what interviews with Syrian refugees. The last time I was able to make a trip to Syria was in 2010, but nevertheless I was able to interview refugees, as well as diplomats from various Western countries who left over the summer, and try to find what can Iraq teach us about the current conflict in Syria. I thought I would approach this discussion by focusing on, let's say, what I would say 5 distortions or 5 myths that I see in the mainstream media, as well as in policy-making circles. And what does my experience looking at the Iraqi documents and the interviews I've conducted tell us about those myths that tend to be repeated in policy circles as well as the mainstream media. I would say the first one is kind of a notion that keeps on being repeated, and it's we could say under the rubric of when the regime falls. Okay? And why would I have an issue with this is that the notion of when the regime falls, almost as an inevitability, belies the fact that the regime has still managed to stay in power for 3 years. Or I should say the Assad government has managed to stay in power for 3 years. But also, to answer a question, how did Hafez al-Assad and his government manage to stay in power for 30 years? Okay, this is a much more profound question. Keep in mind, this is a state that went through 3 military coups in 1949. If you looked at also on the converse, Iraq was the first country to have a military coup in the region in 1936. Between 1936 and 1941, you had 10 military coups. So the question is, you have a similarity. Now, the leadership of Hafez al-Assad and Saddam Hussein are quite different. But nevertheless, the tactics, the strategy they used to stay in power, I do find some parallel similarities. And the similarities is this: both the leaders were able to end a pattern of repeating military coups, some within the span of 3 within a year, some. But by 1968, the Ba'ath government of Bakr and Saddam Hussein, as well as the government of Hafez al-Assad, by the time he's ensconced in power in 1971, was able to end this repeating cycle of military coups. And the strategy for ending that cycle of military coups can also provide us an answer into why has Hafez al-Assad's government managed, and his son Bashar's government has managed to stay in power today. With the same and the question I always ask myself, that even with this intense conflict going on in Syria, why does an enterprising general not take power for himself? In other words, why doesn't, let's say an Alawite general or who's close to the center of power, not launch a coup? It would seem ideal. And it was the same question I was asking when a war in Iraq seemed inevitable in 2003. It would seem ideal for an Iraqi general, well-placed. And in fact, that was the hope of U.S. policymakers. They had always, for 10 years from the 91 Gulf War, up into the 2003, they had placed their hope in what was called the silver bullet theory. One high-ranking general taking power for himself, removing Saddam Hussein, and hence avoiding the need for war. So the question was, why does the silver bullet theory never work? Why does a high-ranking general never able to seize power? And I would suggest that there is some kind of system of governance that is able to preempt any coup. I would argue that these governments are coup-proof. And one element of coup-proofing I've found is the creation of multiple security agencies, often overlapping in purpose, and not only monitoring society, but also monitoring rival security agencies. Now, that brings me to myth 2. Sometimes I always see this kind of magical number that there are 17 intelligence agencies in Syria. I have no idea where this number comes from. It's a fact, it's a mistake. Really, officially, there's only 4. The number 17 gets confused because people confuse the branches of various security agencies and count that as a separate agency. But for the most part, there's primarily 4 agencies in Syria, just as there was in Iraq. And 4 was always some kind of magic number because usually you had 2 more or less tasked with international intelligence, 2 tasked with domestic intelligence. And that way, not only did you have competition in terms of monitoring the civilian population, but then those civilian agencies would also watch each other. And the same with the foreign intelligence agencies. Not only would they monitor foreign intelligence threats, but they would always also challenge each other. Okay. Then the third part of the element in how these states, both under Saddam Hussein and the Assads keep in power, is what I would, well, it's not what I would call, but in the literature it's called parallel militarism. Okay, in other words, how do you prevent a military coup is by having numerous militaries. Okay, and just to give you the old formula of launching a military coup in Iraq and Syria, historically, since the creation of both these states, all was needed was simply a brigade-sized element of the military to march into the capital, take over the radio station, take over the presidential palace, and announce the coup, and see if the various other elements within the military would declare their loyalty. Okay? What Hafez al-Assad did and Saddam Hussein did was create basically what were counter-armies. so that to prevent that cycle of brigades marching into the capital, they create military units today that we know as the Republican Guards, both in Iraq and Syria, more or less designed not for counter-coup purposes, preventing that renegade brigade from entering the capital, as well as manning those Republican Guards with an in-group. Okay, I don't want to go through the kind of mainstream media mistake of saying it's always Sunnis or always Alawites. It happens to be particular segments of either the Arab Sunni community in Iraq or particular segments of the Alawite community. But that's also the other myth, is kind of taking an entire ethno-sectarian community and saying these are the ones responsible for filling the tools of repression. So the third myth then I would say is, well, let me get to, besides the structure, even Republican Guards weren't enough. Then you had because even Republican Guards in both states were hesitant to conduct acts that were considered beneath them. And what we have in Iraq and in Syria is the creation then of paramilitary units. In Iraq, it was known as the Fedayeen. In Syria, they've been known as the Shabiha, okay? And in Syria, it's the Shabiha that's been attributed to civilian massacres in places such as Hulla. In Iraq, the Fedayeen made their name for conducting these execution campaigns of people who were allegedly prostitutes, but these kind of brutal paramilitary campaigns that were designed to spread intimidation in society that the regular elite military units were loath to conduct. Okay? So I would say then the third would be, well, let's say the third is it's a new myth, and it's that Iran is trying to create a new Hezbollah-like organization among the Alawites in Syria. I would say, and if these reports are true, if Iran was creating a new Hezbollah-like militia in Syria, then they would probably have created this force in Lebanon. But what the media reports are telling us are numbers of Alawites are being flown to Iran and being trained there with the name the Popular Army, okay, or the People's Army. If this is true, then this is an organization that is probably more aligned with the Basij militia or the mass mobilization militias in Iran. But let me just jump to the fourth and fifth. And the fourth, I would argue, is that the distinction is rarely made between the sectarian, let's say, affiliation between the Alawites of Syria and Twelver Shias in Iran and Lebanon. And why is this distinction important? Is just for those of you who aren't familiar with the sectarian, what's the difference? What is an Alawite Shia vis-a-vis kind of a Twelver Shia? If I would describe Alawite beliefs, and this is what my research was in Syria, was to kind of see how Alawite practices manifest themselves among the Alawites in Syria. And to my surprise, I found out that most Alawites in Syria didn't know what their beliefs are. But nevertheless, from reading the scant literature that exists out there, it was a sect founded by Twelver Shias, but combined elements of Gnostic Christianity, Manichaeism, so on and so forth. But nevertheless, I find that the Twelver Shias, for the most part in Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria, Iran, Lebanon, don't necessarily recognize the Alawites as Shia like themselves. And why is this distinction important to make is that I would say the mainstream media and kind of the policy-making circles suggest that Iran and Hezbollah are supporting the Alawites due to a shared sectarian affiliation. And this tends to be misleading because I could give you a lot of cases where Iran doesn't necessarily support other Shias in the geopolitical region due to shared sectarian affiliation. The most prominent case would be Iran's role vis-a-vis the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, where here you had Azerbaijan, that was a Twelver Shia country, for the most part, whereas Iran took the side with Armenia and Russia. Now the final case, and let me just read an example from the London, it deals with Syria's WMD program and the potential use of that WMD program. And just let me read briefly from an article that came out from in the London Times that says, defense sources warn that despite the discovery, now this is a question of whether it's a soil sample taken from Syria would reveal the use of chemical weapons in the current conflict. So defense sources warn that despite the discovery, there were unanswered questions. There has been no Iraq moment one source said, referring to the chemical attack by Saddam Hussein against the Kurds in Halabja in 1988, which killed about 5,000 people. And this is why I find the research between Iraq and the current Syria case so important, is that Halabja has been kind of used as a rubric or a benchmark, that if a Halabja-style attack were to be conducted in Syria, would this be the final red line that would bring international attention? And what's important about this is then to kind of demystify or kind of understand what was the reason for the Halabja attack. And would a similar style attack in Syria occur? I would argue no, that the comparisons between the attack in Halabja and the notion would Syria conduct such an attack is mistaken, because the attack of Halabja has been misunderstood. And this is where analyzing the documents captured from Saddam Hussein's Iraq are so valuable, in that it provides insight, one of the few inside perspectives of how a government calculates the use of WMD deployment. Okay? And the important thing to realize about the chemical weapons programs in both Iraq and Syria, that where they were originally designed for deterrence and strategic parity, okay, with another state, not an internal enemy. So that the CW program in Syria was designed for strategic parity vis-a-vis Israel. The CW program in Iran, well, rhetorically speaking, Iraq was kind of constructing this program as well as for strategic parity vis-a-vis Israel's nuclear program. But in reality, debriefings from Iraqis after 2003 mentioned over and over again that the value of the WMD program was for strategic parity against Iran's numerically superior forces during the Iran-Iraq War. You have this repeated over and over again, kind of an unapologetic tone among the Iraqi officials that, what could we have done? We were outnumbered on the front lines. The only thing that saved us by being overwhelmed by Iranian forces, particularly the Basij and the Revolutionary Guards, were these WMD munitions that we had. Now, from the captured documents, what did the use of chemical weapons and the few occasions of nerve gas tell us about the Iraqi use of these programs? Was that the Iraqis perceived them as being useful on static, kind of trench-like conditions with the Iranian foe. Okay? Now, why is this important? Is that because this doesn't describe the conditions of fighting in Syria. Okay? And keep in mind, when these weapons were deployed, the Iraqis, they always had the fear of blowback. Okay, that these weapons were unpredictable. And even when these weapons were deployed, they were always deployed kind of in the rear line position of the Iraqi forces. And what the Iraqis also deduced was that the power of these weapons, of course, the effects were horrific on the Iranian forces, but the real value of these weapons and how these weapons kind of served as a force multiplier was the psychological effect on the Iranian forces. But the other lesson we get from these documents is that Saddam Hussein and his elites used these weapons because over and over again they believed they could get away with using these weapons. Now remember, these are the days before this chemical weapons convention. Okay? And from Saddam Hussein and his inner core's understanding of chemical weapon norms was that the various Geneva protocols were merely scraps of paper. And the fascinating thing was that Saddam Hussein repeated over and over again that the international community would understand that we could use these weapons now against an internal foe, the Kurdish rebels, because they are siding with our enemy. And surely the international community would understand this is how you deal with traitors, is that we use these weapons. Okay? So really what Saddam Hussein was more or less thinking, and these are taped conversations that he usually had with his inner government. Of course, he probably never assumed that these taped conversations would be released eventually to the public, was that he could use these weapons because, number one, the international community would understand, and that there was no punitive kind of international norms that would punish him for doing so. Okay? In other words, the chemical weapons were used by the Iraqi state, number one, because it wasn't so much being used against rebels. Okay? It was used because, of course, those rebels were siding with an Iranian foe, number one. Number two, those weapons could be used because the geography of Halabja were ideal for using these weapons. And the geography of Halabja, excuse me, the small town was hemmed in by a range of mountains as well as a lake. Okay? So that it would be assured that if these weapons were to be deployed, they would have the maximum effect. Okay? And number three, the realization was because the enemy was concentrated in this place, those weapons could have a valuable effect. Now, what's missing in Syria is, of course, the rebels aren't being kind of working in tandem with a foreign military. Okay? So that to say that Syria would use WMDs against an internal foe, well, number one, the threat perception would be is a bit different. Okay? Halabja had fallen to a foreign army from the Iraqi perspective. And number two, what was missing back then, and what is clearly present now, is the international community. I mean, now you have kind of an international, let's say, the CWC, or the Chemical Weapons Convention, is not only in place, but you've had foreign powers saying that this would be a red line. If not would justify international intervention, we're seeing in the recent debates, perhaps it would justify a more enhanced arming of the rebels, and perhaps this would serve as a deterrent for Syria to use these. And then number three is just the nature of the conflict would not make it ideal for chemical weapons deployment. Okay. What we're seeing is chemical weapons don't have much effect against dispersed bands of rebels. Okay. So if you're arguing from a purely military perspective, it wouldn't make sense that these weapons would be used. And then finally, and to conclude, what I'm seeing is the government of Syria has managed to survive 3 years. And this is why it would kind of be counterproductive for the state. So far has managed to find this means of staying in power for 3 years. Whatever benefits chemical weapons would have on the battlefield, and I argue they would be merely psychological. They would be merely demoralizing against the rebellion. And it seems like the Syrian state has found a way to demoralize the rebels by simply deploying Scud missiles, these wildly inaccurate missiles against civilian centers. It doesn't seem likely from the regime's perspective that CW or chemical weapons would be any of use, and that it's managed to find a formula to maintain the power on its side, so that I don't predict chemical weapons being used in the future, nor do I predict that the government in Damascus would be falling anytime soon. And I'll conclude there.
Thank you, Ibrahim. And you ended on a note that we can hold you to.
Yes.
We can judge your stargazing abilities, whether they fall or not. But thank you. That was very good. You know, if anybody's tweeting, I think coup-proofing needs to be in your tweet, maybe as a hashtag. So from a different perspective, we invited another scholar of Syria, Dr. Julian Barnes-Dacey, Senior Policy Fellow with the European Council of Foreign Relations based here in London. From 2007 to 2010, he was based in Damascus, in Syria as a researcher and a journalist, writing for various publications, including the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Christian Science Monitor. So, Julian, we're very glad that you were able to join and give us some different perspectives. Sure. It's not a debate, as I said, but shed some light on it from a different perspective.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you very much for having me. Yes, I mean, if I can just kind of add some comments to what Ibrahim has already laid out on the table, I think to begin with, I guess the whole idea of regime resilience, to my mind, has been slightly flipped on its head since the beginning of the conflict. I mean, I think the question is, why would the regime not be resilient after more than 40 years in power? And I think there was an expectation amongst policymakers, amongst governments, that the regime would fall quickly. I think that was very much a rush of blood to the head that followed everything in North Africa. But frankly, this is a regime that has been entrenched in power, using the most harsh of techniques to maintain that hold on power for so long. And I think, you know, that is the perspective of a regime that has made itself resilient over decades in power. And really the question is, how do you undo that resilience over time, not how does one expect it to crumble quite quickly? And I think there are three key areas that I just want to touch on. I mean, one is what Ibrahim has talked about, but the security element, which has clearly been the principal driver of the regime's response to the uprising. The second is, frankly, that it does have a wide base of popular support that goes beyond this idea of a sectarian Alawite militia. And I think that's something that gets underplayed a lot. And thirdly, of course, the international context and the way that it's been able to leverage, exploit that for its own ends, and that has really been critical. So, I mean, just briefly, on the security institutions, as mentioned, I mean, this is a regime that has been waiting for this moment for 40 years. I think that since day one, they expected the Sunnis to rise up against them. So it wasn't purely an internal coup-proofing, but it was a a security mechanism that would actually guard against the majority of the population rising up against them. And so they've established very tight security institutions that draw in direct family members of the Assad Makhlouf clan, draw more further on the Alawite population at large, some of the key tribes. Some of the key divisions are, of course, all controlled by the Alawites. And they have used these divisions, they've used this control of the security apparatus very strategically, very tactically, to ensure that actually their grip has been maintained without any real threat. I mean, while the regime has suffered setbacks in the north, down south, none of the key centers of power have really been threatened by the military face of the rebels. And I think that is something that one has to really think about. I mean, even today, one talks about the regime being on its last legs, about to fall. No, the regime controls pretty much all of the urban centers. There is no direct immediate threat to its hold on power, and certainly they maintain military superiority by quite some way. And I think you could probably make the case that actually they haven't deployed all of the military apparatus at their disposal, and that they still have the potential to escalate. Quite critical that unlike in Tunisia and Egypt, you haven't seen the split between the regime and the security apparatus, and that's something I don't think which we'll see. And I think that ties in to the existential Alawite dilemma here, and that's perhaps why you haven't seen a general rising up, is that actually they're in a common boat here, and they see that even if an Alawite general, who are frankly the key figures there, were to dispose of Assad, they would still be facing an uprising that has the same goals, which is to dislodge the regime, and by extension dislodge the Alawite hold on power, which has been there for so long. So, I mean, I think, firstly, they're only comfortable on the security level. They've been very keen to make it a security battle since the outset. You saw very quickly when it was essentially a political struggle, they militarized it, they have arrested the more moderate political leaders of the opposition, leaving the more radical figures out there. They've been quite keen to play up the narrative of jihadi extremists, because this is a territory they feel comfortable on. But then secondly, and this leads into the second point, this fits into a narrative that actually plays to their popular support that they still maintain within the regime, not only amongst the Alawites, but amongst other minorities, Christians, the Druze, but also amongst the Sunni urban class, who over the last decades have been co-opted into the regime. And they all look upon the Assad regime, frankly, as their protector against a rural uprising that is backward, is Islamist, is what have you, but in no ways will be able to secure and maintain their rights, their interests, or their positions as minorities in the state. So I think this is a significant section of the population that continues to support Assad, and by pushing the rebellion into a more militarized front, by playing up, by deliberately and cynically playing up the more extremist violence of the struggle, these are groups that have actually been pushed further into a corner in support of Assad. In a sense, Assad is holding them hostage because he's made the fight so polarized, so divisive, and so extreme to a certain degree that they see no other way out. And this was where you, I guess, draw on the sectarianism, which the regime has instrumentalized by arming the Alawites, by arming Christians in some of these locations, taking advantage of certain incidents to play up these existential minority fears. But of course, the opposition has also played upon, and if anything, you could make the case that the opposition is more overt in its sectarian language today than the regime is. The regime uses it more cynically and instrumentalizes it, but actually some of the messages you hear coming out of the fighters, some of the names of the brigades, the sense of tying into jihadi groups is something that comes out very clearly for a lot of these minorities, and so rallies them behind the regime. And I think, playing on to the sense of popular support is, of course, the weakness of the opposition. The fact that they haven't been able to present a national, inclusive, credible alternative. The fact that they haven't been able to draw in the Kurds and other minorities, and that has been key. So the regime has very much played off the security and the support elements and created a narrative that plays to its favor, and I think it feels comfortable on that. It's very much trying to recreate the model of the 1980s, where it did face an uprising for the Muslim Brotherhood. In that case, it responded with force, and it mobilized popular support behind it by portraying it as an extremist uprising that threatened the fabric of the country. So that's what it's been trying to do. Of course, it's pushed that way too far. It's lost control of it. It's something that it can no longer keep in check. And of course, it made the fatal mistake of deploying violence with such brutality that there is no way back. There is such polarization and division now that it's very much hard to see the regime actually managing to do what it did in the 1980s of regrouping and reestablishing full control. And of course, I mean, in all of this, that there is a cynicism of trying to make itself indispensable, both domestically to minorities, to the Sunni urban class who are petrified at this rural rebellion, but also internationally. I mean, they play up this idea of jihadism, of al-Qaeda, and they are trying to present themselves as a bulwark against extremism, the breakup of Syria, regional turmoil. And it has some truth. It's self-serving. It's been created by the Assad regime, but such has been the nihilism of Assad and his chosen security policy that actually that is the reality on the ground right now. Thirdly, just briefly, of course, the international climate. I mean, that's something that the regime has exploited, taken advantage, but of course also been very lucky in terms of the regional and international dynamics of the moment. More than in terms of the region, obviously, the Iran-Hezbollah alliance has been key. This is an alliance going back decades, and I mean, don't forget that Syria was the only Arab country pretty much to support the Iranians during the Iran-Iraq war, and now that situation has been reversed, Syria is seen as key for the Iranians, not just in terms of maintaining a strategic position, because of course they also have Lebanon and Iraq within their remit, or within their sphere of influence to a certain degree, but within the broader idea of guns being trained on Iran at the moment, whether it's a nuclear program, whether it's in Gulf states, there's a sense that Syria is a domino which leads to further incursions, that next will be Hezbollah, next will be Iraq, and I think the Iranians are very keen on setting down a red line there. So the Iranians have obviously been providing very substantial support. At the same time, of course, they've been very fortunate in the international moment. The Russians, following on from the Libya scenario situation, have been keen to stress that there cannot be further cases of regime transformation or regime removal from outside, and that has played to their favor. So it's been quite fortunate in that sense. Again, I fear that the opposition have missed a trick here by falling down and using this zero-sum narrative of if Assad falls, the regime will be wrenched away, or Syria will be wrenched away from Iran, from this axis, actually where it's entrenched the desire by the Iranians, by Hezbollah, to reassert their support for the regime, because the opposition have made it so clear that they are aligning themselves with the Gulf and the West against that alliance. So I think Assad has taken advantage of that very strategically, but been very lucky as well. So I'll stop there. Yes, the regime has been weakened, but on these different fronts, it maintains force, it maintains support, and I think it's a long way from being down and out.
So, Julian, you agree with Ibrahim then that the regime is here for the foreseeable future, and so with that hypothesis before us, let's explore some of these issues a little bit further. We have a half an hour to do so. I have some questions of my own, and I might just start off by asking Ibrahim, you laid out at the end of your talk the reasons why the Syria case is so different from Iraq in terms of use of chemical weapons, that you would conclude that they haven't used them and they wouldn't use them. Would I be right in seeing that in your presentation?
The benefits, the disadvantages, I would say, outweigh the benefits. That's now there's been recent talk about what is the soil sample going to reveal? Have they been used? Has there been a breakdown in chain of command, for example? Could these weapons be used if there's a breakdown in chain of the command? And now, based on my experience reading the Iraq documents, usually deployment of these kind of weapons within the military hierarchy doesn't involve a very complex chain of command. Usually the discretion to use these weapons are usually very tightly controlled. So kind of a scenario of the breakdown of the chain of command and having these weapons deploy is a possibility, but I would say highly unlikely based on my reading of the Iraq documents. The Iraqis could use these documents because they could get away with it, and they found an actual benefit to it. In Syria, from the perspective of the government, from the way I would read the government behavior, they can't get away with it. And number two, it wouldn't serve much benefit strategically, or I should say tactically on the battlefield anyway.
Thanks. You know, I was so struck by the research you've done and listening to the transcripts. I can't believe that Saddam Hussein didn't learn anything from Richard Nixon and not keep his conversations all recorded. Okay, Nick Redman in the back, and then Dina Esfandiari, and then in the front we'll get you. And so state name and
Thank you. Nicholas Redman, Senior Fellow at the IISS. Two questions, if I may. Firstly, what about the roots of this crisis? Some of the changes in government policy and fiscal policy towards it. As I understand, Hafez was much better at looking after the Sunni rural poor, and the current president less so. Whether it was, to what extent was that a matter of choice? To what extent was that a matter of a voluntary decision? Second, as you're both quite positive on the at least medium-term prospects for this regime, could you say something about financing for it? I mean, if they have no economic activity as such going on, I don't see where the revenue comes from unless it comes from Iran. Thank you.
Julian, why don't you
Sure.
take a crack, and then if you have something to add, Ibrahim.
In terms of the roots of the crisis, I mean, I think the economic front and the abandonment of that rural Sunni underclass was absolutely the key driver. I mean, this was first and foremost, to my mind, a rural uprising driven by economic grievances, which then fed into political discontent. But effectively, over the last 20 years, in the last 10 years of Hafez, but particularly since Bashar came to power, you did have this significant, or you had an opening in economic liberalization, very much focused on the urban centers, accompanied by drought, economic problems, fueled by mismanagement, corruption, which really actually fed poverty, increased population movements to the cities. And effectively, these were elements of the population that were abandoned by the regime. They tightened their control. It became much more like a mafia state. The Makhlouf clan, Rami Makhlouf, Assad's cousin, very much took over control of the economy. There was a lot of resentment of that. You had a huge disparity of wealth emerging, both within the cities, and I think that's why it's crucial to say that, I mean, Damascus itself, the outskirts of suburbs have been on fire since day one. This is not, there's a sense that Damascus has been safe, but the center has been safe, where you saw the fruits of this liberalization, where the Sunni merchant class profited, but the suburbs where you had these population movements from the rural areas of the country, they were revolting from day one, and that fed into the sense that they had been forgotten by the state. So I think that was central, that was very much key, and to my mind it was a blunder by the regime. I mean, it showed that how poorly they read the country, how poorly they read the dynamics, as opposed to a deliberate strategy to take control of that. In terms of financing, I mean, I think clearly the regime has coped much better than most people expected. I think there's still a significant amount of money, it seems, coming into the country from regime backers, the Iranians and the Russians. But there's also the point that all of the money that goes in to support the opposition gets recirculated within the economy. And that, to a strong degree, is helping them finance it. There's a black market, there's assistance coming in from the Iraqis, there's trade from Lebanon. So I think there's lots of different networks that they can rely on. Whether they can continue to pay salaries, state salaries, I mean, they've already been cutting down, but they haven't closed a lot of them off. There are even elements of opposition-controlled areas which are still getting, where civil servants still get state salaries. So, I mean, which says to me they're in a stronger position financially than most people expect.
Also, just to add a note to that, if you remember in the early days when reporters were allowed, remember that one of the first targets weren't the statues of Hafez al-Assad, as you would see in these kind of Arab Spring events. It was the Makhlouf Syriatel franchise, those stores which were, the products of the neoliberalization policy. Yeah. So especially in Dar'a, I think those were the first targets.
So what were those stores?
One of the Assad's maternal side has a monopoly on the mobile networks. So, of course, when people were protesting against kind of the beneficiaries of state patronage. What was the obvious target? The Syriatel
I got it.
network owned by Rami Makhlouf.
Okay.
I mean, if I just share one quick anecdote, I remember when I was living in Damascus, you'd get new bars opening all the time. And just before I left, they set up this new bar in a very poor area of town. This was in 2010. Very expensive, very much like the bars in Beirut in terms of lack of conservatism, dress code, music, alcohol, whatever. Yes, in Metro Duma, no? And, but this was positioned in a poor area. It was surrounded by houses of people looking in. And you could feel the tension. And just before I left, it actually got firebombed by people in the surrounding area. And this was before the uprising, before Egypt, before Tunisia. So it really paints this picture of the tension.
Thank you. Dina, and then we'll come to the gentleman in front.
Dina Esfandiari, IISS. So I have a question for each of you. The first one is, so you said, Ibrahim, you said that it was unlikely that they would use chemical weapons, and I agree with you. But what happens if Assad is cornered, if it's the last resort? I mean, surely then all bets are off. And Julian, for you, you mentioned that Iran would support Syria to the end. I'm not sure if I agree with you on that, because there is a lot of division within the regime, growing division within the regime about whether it's a good idea to continue supporting Syria.
In the Iran regime.
In Iran, yeah, sorry. About whether it's a good idea to continue supporting Syria. Now, for the moment, they're going to keep going the way they're going. But given this growing internal division on Syria, given the elections, given all the attention it's getting from the nuclear program, and also given the fact that Iran is actually starting to plan for the day after Assad, what happens in the unlikely scenario that Iran decides to pull its support for Assad? Is that the turning point? Thanks.
Ibrahim, you go first.
You brought up what's been called the bunker scenario, which has been, what if it's the final days of Hafiz al-Assad, if the regime is kind of has its final battles in in Damascus, or withdraws to what's called the kind of Alawite heartland, would these weapons be deployed? And again, I would still say no, based on my reading of Hafiz's legacy and Bashar's legacy, in that, as over the last 3 years, he's portrayed himself as a protector of the Alawites. I think he likes to be seen that way. And if he wants, if he's going to go down, and this is a question, I think if we were to use, in his final moments, chemical weapons, that would, I think, bring the mass kind of retaliation by the more or less Sunni majority against the Alawites. In other words, if mass retaliations wouldn't happen if if Bashar falls, it would most likely happen if chemical weapons had been used, or were to be used. I think that would bring kind of this mass slaughter that the Alawites fear. And so I think in the kind of end game scenario, I still think he wouldn't use it. And this is just my reading of his behavior, because that would bring, I think, a mass slaughter of the Alawites. And just for Iran's policy, I would agree with you. And that's why I think this notion between Alawites and 12er Shias is an important distinction to make. It's not because of shared sectarian affiliation that Iran supports the current government. I think it's because of geostrategic. And if it finds it in the geostrategic interest to cut a deal, I think it would abandon Assad to make that deal.
I mean, I completely agree. I mean, I think Iran is key in terms of if you want to de-escalate and get a solution to this. I think the Iranians have to be brought in, and I've been advocating for that. I think at the moment, because of the fact that the Syria crisis has become zero-sum, not just within Syria, but regionally, internationally, the fact that actually the Americans are refusing to engage with the Iranians on Syria, the fact that actually in the US press, within the opposition, this is being painted as a means of dislodging Iran completely, very zero-sum, absolutist. Because of that, Iran is not going to be constructive. So my view is that Iran, because of its influence, because of its leverage and ongoing support over the regime, needs to be brought into the conversation precisely so that you can unpick some of those divisions that you've been talking about within the Iranian regime. I mean, I know for a fact that Tehran has been reaching out not only to opposition figures, but more broadly to people working on the Syria issue. They want to be at the table. They want to be part of it. And I think they need to be. And I completely agree. This is not a sectarian issue. This is a political struggle, a military struggle for control in the region. It's a Cold War between the Saudis, the Qataris, not so much the Qataris, but the Saudis and the Iranians. It's a broader strategic battle with the Americans and the nuclear issue. The Iranians are key. They have to be brought in, and I think they will be brought in eventually. And to my mind, whether it's now or whether it's in 2 years down the line, you're going to get a solution that inevitably involves the Iranians. Just briefly on the chemical weapons, I think the regime could probably use them and could probably get away with them. I don't think they will use them, but I think the conflict has become so messy. I think Western policy is so confused. My hunch is if they use them in very contained manner, they would probably get away with it.
Okay, thank you, Julian. We do have some divergence of view here then. We'll go first, you, sir, and then you second.
Thank you, David Butcher, Chatham House. I do have a couple of questions relating to the Iraq parallels, but first, if I may, a short observation back on the neoliberal and Syria tell. And I think it's an interesting concept because, to my view, the Makhloufs of this world give neoliberalism a bad name, and they're not proper neoliberals. And in fact, there was quite a lot of pushback against Makhlouf and his monopolistic practices. Syria Tel also was an example of a duopoly with the other firm and not a proper telecoms license. And in fact, just before the uprising, there was a process of actually eating into Makhlouf's monopoly through turning these into licenses, which would involve him paying up. Syria Tel, of course, now is still a very important source of revenue for the regime. Its earnings were up last year, and half of those earnings go straight to the state. And that's about $500 million a year and about 400 from the other. So that sense of the circulation being a prop is still important. So apologies for going off on that one. What I was interested in exploring was looking at Iraq and the oil for food program and how, in a sense, shortages and rationing worked in a sense to strengthen the power of the central state, and whether there are any parallels there in Syria that you might see. And then also briefly, when you're talking about the Iraq parallels, the 1991 uprising and the speed and ferocity with which that was put down. Again, Toby Dodge, I think, puts out a figure of perhaps, or Haider Khouria, sorry, of 150,000 people killed in a very short space of time. And that clearly being slightly different than the ramping up of the impression that's happened in the Bashar al-Assad.
Ibrahim, I think that's mostly your question.
Actually, I just conducted a study comparing the conflict in Syria with the 91 uprising, based on what the Iraqi documents revealed about the 1991 uprising. And it's surprising because we see similar tactics in both cases. And perhaps this could be attributed to kind of Soviet training or then Soviet restructuring and then afterwards Russian training of how to conduct more or less what is counterinsurgency. And the tactics are similar. Destroying kind of urban centers from the outside, then slowly moving in your whatever armor you can into the urban centers. We do find similarities. Similar tactics as well as by rebels in 1991 and in Syria in the present. But how could Iraq be able to kind of crush its uprising so much quicker than Syria can? Even though the tactics are the same, the equipment is the same, the strength of the rebels is more or less the same. I think number one is neither the rebels in the south, and keep in mind there were a mix of Shia groups that were coming from Iran, combined with disaffected soldiers who survived the front line in Kuwait, combined with the Kurdish militias. The supply lines weren't able to keep the rebels armed for a sustained period of time. And I think that's one benefit of the Syrians. Regardless of kind of disruptions or the amount of arms, they've been able to manage to keep a supply line, whereas I think Iran was scared of providing further arms to the rebels in the south. for the fears, would that bring kind of American wrath against it? So I think what the 1991 rebels were able to do was just capture government stores, and when those ran out, that's when they suffered the brunt of the retaliation from the Iraqi state. And keep in mind, most of the Republican Guard units were intact after the 1991 Gulf War to bring about the wrath, the wrath of the state upon them. And so you had a combination of heavy, intensive urban fighting, which we're also seeing in Syria, but the inability of the rebels in the north and the south to sustain themselves. That the tactics were similar, in that both Syria and Iraq has been, what they do is fire, put out fires in various places. Take one city, once that's been subdued or destroyed, move on to the next one. We're seeing that tactic in Syria. We're seeing it in Iraq, but of course with a lot heavier casualties in the Iraqi case over a much shorter period of time because the rebellion wasn't able to sustain itself.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Sir, you're next. I'm sorry, is there a microphone so we can get up? Sorry, Charlotte, you need the microphone? Well, it's coming, it's coming.
Looking at the issue of the resilience of the regime in Damascus, is there a case to be made for separating the regime from Bashar Assad? I mean, do we need to stick to the idea that it's Bashar and the regime are inseparable? Because one can look, forward and start believing that a lot of people who now rally around Bashar may come to the realization that he is leading us into a catastrophe beyond belief. I mean, the destruction, these cities are being, destroyed, and all that. I mean, at some point there must come a realization, acknowledgement. Is this the man to lead us against these takfiriyin, these jihadists? Are we supposed to rally around his banner, or is there somebody else that can do this job, because this job needs to be done at some stage? And I'm also I've been noticing with some interest declarations being made recently by this, for example, the Free Syrian Army, which has been quite critical of the opposition, and it's being dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood and so forth. So can you imagine a situation where elements within the proper Syrian army and the FSA, who see this common enemy as presenting itself, could that bring around some kind of, if you like, coalition that we haven't seen yet emerge, but maybe something to be talked, to be imagined for the future? And it is going to still be, I'm sure, a fight that ahead of us. It's not going to happen overnight, but these are trends that I think we should be looking at. And as far as the idea that the regime is still in control, yes, to a great extent it still is. But a year ago we were hearing all the time that the regime is in control because Aleppo and Damascus haven't been touched by the revolution. Well, we see a big change happening. Even the center of Damascus is no longer safe. I know from people, family and so forth, they don't go out anymore in the center of Damascus after 5 o'clock or anything like that. So the situation is changing. It is slow, but I don't see the regime holding on in the same extent that maybe a year ago it was capable of doing.
Well, thank you. It's helpful to have real experts in the audience as well as at the podium, at the panel here. But Julian, I think you can maybe take that first.
Just on the last question, I mean, on the last point, I agree, and I would say that's where it's almost transitioning from a government against against an insurgency to a civil war situation, in which case one views the regime as one actor amongst many, and they are the most dominant actor, and they will be for some time to come. But clearly they are losing their ability to control the whole country and their power, absolutely, and I think they will continue to do that. In terms of internal divisions within those supporting the regime and Bashar and the regime, I mean, I fear it's too late for that. I mean, you do hear every so often of rumors of rumblings within the kind of Alawite tribes in the communities along the coast, discord, unhappiness with where the regime is taking them. But I think that was a scenario that needed to unfold much earlier for it to be credible. I think at this point, the situation has become too polarized. the degree of sectarianism is too dominant. And I think it's very hard. I mean, the Alawites and other minorities have very much tied their fate to that of the regime. And this has been a cynical tool of the regime that's holding them hostage. But I see it very hard for them to think that they can roll back on that and have some credible future if they don't see the regime winning. Plus, of course, the regime does have such tight control over the key security apparatuses. So in terms of this coup-proofing, I mean, this is his family. This is his cousins, his nephews, his immediate clan who control all of these networks. They are directly associated with Assad personally, and they're not going to jump ship. So I think that's very hard. In terms of the army and the FSA and the external opposition, I mean, I think the external opposition is hopeless. I think it has no legitimacy other than Muazzam Khatib, who's been sidelined. I think the West needs to stop supporting, I mean, Hito, people like that. They're nice, but I'm not sure they're political leaders or they have any legitimacy and credibility on the ground. But whether that means that you're eventually going to see the army and the FSA linking up, I mean, elements within the army that may eventually break away, perhaps. But you know, at the moment, the divisions are becoming deeper and more polarized, and if anything, the defections have dried up. So you could almost make the case that those that are still in the army, and they're by no means not purely Alawites. There are a lot of Sunnis and others still there, are behind the regime. The regime controls their narrative, their worldview, all the information that is being pummeled their way. It's going to be a while, I think, before you see groups of them, brigades, the artillery, the air force, tying any linkages with the FSA.
Ibrahim?
It's, in terms of FSA and the Takfiris you mentioned, which I assume you're meaning the Salafis, or which now the group that merged with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, this element of the uprising. There have been reports that it's already started. The elements of the FSA have started fighting the kind of more Salafi-like elements. And that also is another parallel in Iraq, where you had elements of the Iraqi insurgency who turned against the very same elements within Iraq itself, which the group that coalesced into Al-Qaeda in Iraq also faced off against Iraqis who were against US forces, but also very much against the style that was imposed by the Islamic State in Iraq, which was basically Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But in terms of the center, that's the center versus the periphery in the conflict, I think this was illustrated, and the idea of the title that I got was Regime Resilience was in response to the events that occurred in July in Damascus, where here you had a bomb that eliminated a lot of the regime insiders, the key enforcers of the state, Hashim Ikhtiyar or Bakhtiyar, or whichever, Hisham, sorry, Asif Shoka, and all these people were eliminated, but you were able to find replacements, and the government kept on functioning as it did in the past. So yeah, definitely the center isn't safe.
Thank you.
But it still manages to keep on.
Let's take two last questions. I'm sorry, Laura. I think we're running out of time. We're going to take Ben Berry and then the fourth row here, gentlemen. And sorry about the last two.
Thanks for some really useful insight. I had extensive contact with the Muhabarat in 2004, and the senior leadership seemed to me to be utterly conditioned by a defining moment in their career, which was '82. And one of them said to me, this was as defining to us as politically and militarily the Falklands was to Mrs. Thatcher, which I thought was quite an interesting insight. I am much less sanguine than Ibrahim about the use of chemical weapons. I mean, I've studied this in previous conflicts, including the First World War, and unprotected civilian populations in small spaces are the best possible target for a cynical chemical weapon planner, and the regime has the means to deliver. And there are people in Damascus who could think that many previous declared red lines have been crossed. And you could see, as a tipping point is released, the temptation to do this becoming overriding. If I might just ask you a question about Bashar, one thing that's little discussed is that he was never the crown prince. And it was striking in 2004 that out in the sticks, in the rural areas and in the back streets, there was still quite a lot of graffiti showing showing Basil, who had been the anointed heir, the crown prince. And I wonder how much of that is a factor in Bashar's behavior.
Okay, scuttle the microphone over here, please.
Daniel Moore from King's College. I actually have a question from a different perspective regarding maybe another mainstream narrative or myth that's out there. I think I saw in quite a few headlines that if the Assad government is cornered, they may turn and attack Israel in order to coalesce around an external enemy. Now, that seems a rather extreme scenario in which the results would be entirely unpredictable, but the government has said on numerous instances that they may engulf the region in flames if it comes to it, and so on and so forth. But is that really a plausible scenario? Is it realistic to expect that if it comes to it, rather than using chemical weapons, they may turn their ire outwards towards the region?
Okay, thank you. So, Ibrahim, you can take the first and any element of the second you would like, and then Julian, you have final comments.
No, definitely. Hama, I think, was the turning point. And I think it's 1982, those events that was kind of a rehearsal, if you will, for the events that played out in the present. But again, I mean, and again, this is, and I could be completely wrong, but again, how I read Bashar's behavior. I think Bashar's only chance of survival, and it's true, I think he does live in the shadow of not only Basil, but also Maher, who's also, also considered kind of on the streets, a lot more tougher, the head of the 4th Division in Syria, a lot more tougher, kind of more of a mirror of Basil, if you will. And that if Maher, you always kind of hear this informally, if Maher was in charge, this uprising would have ended long ago. So I think he's also playing with that element. But if Bashar ever hopes to play out this conflict, it's going to involve kind of maintaining some sort of legitimacy or winning back, let's say, the majority Sunni population. And I think between his survival will depend on showing that the Salafi element of the conflict is a lot worse than his tutelage over the state. And I think the final line between regaining that legitimacy would be using chemical weapons against a civilian center in Syria. That's how I would read it. Okay? And looking at that, then whatever, let's say, tactical benefit from deploying chemical weapons against a civilian center, let's say in a Halabja-style attack, I think there would be no point of Bashar, there would be no going back. If Bashar were to do that, I don't think he could ever hope of regaining legitimacy against the kind of Syrian population that's on the fences, if you will.
Thank you. Ibrahim? Julian?
Thanks. I mean, I agree that what happened in the 80s is key, I think, for two reasons. I mean, one of the key incidents that unfolded, of course, was the massacre of Alawite officers right at the beginning by the Muslim Brotherhood-associated kind of fighters. And that very much shapes the sectarian fears and that they're coming for us in very existential ways, narrative that drives the regime. And secondly, of course, tactics. I mean, they won then by simply bombarding and killing as much as they could, and it worked, and they had popular support. They hoped to recreate that, and that was one of the key mistakes, I'd imagine, or I would suggest, in the regime's response. In terms of Bashar, I mean, I think his status has very much been enhanced within the core community since this uprising began, and people tell me that he's become almost divine amongst a lot of people as a kind of the symbol of what is left of the regime and their own survivals. And I think you could compare his position and that of Maher to what happened with Hafez and his brother in the 80s, where Hafez was seen as being as a politician, the guy you could cut deals with, and his brother was a guy who went out to Palmyra, Tadmor prison, or destroyed Hama. So I think he's trying to play that position with Maher. On Israel, I don't imagine that they would ever launch an attack because they know the response from both Israel and the international community, particularly the West, would be devastating. But can they cause problems? Yes. And I would imagine, as you said, they want to distract, they want to create this sense of regional implosion, if not us, jihadists, Sunnis who are going to attack Israel. So, do you see them withdrawing from the Golan, helping establish jihadists in that area? Do you see them launching over some missiles and blaming it on jihadists in a means of trying to divert some international support for the opposition? Quite possibly.
Well, thank you. I think we've had a very rich discussion exploring in great depth the regime resilience in Damascus and aspects of chemical weapons use and related matters. Before I let you go, I'll make two sorts of administrative announcements. One is to tell you that the next in our series of meetings will be next Wednesday, with Jeffrey Till on the subject of Asia's naval expansion, an arms race in the making. That'll be at 12:30. And then next Thursday with Dr. Lyle Goldstein, China's maritime challenge to the United States, and that will be at noon. The second thing I want to say is to thank those who put this show together today, starting with my colleague Dina, who arranged it all. And then Charlotte Laycock, who was responsible for all the administrative arrangements as well as the microphone. And Tom Wicks, who's putting it all on tape. And unlike Richard Nixon and Saddam Hussein, it's not a secret tape. You can watch it again once it's on our website. And with that, though, mostly I want to thank Ibrahim Al-Marashi and Julian Barnes-Dacey for leading a very interesting discussion that went well beyond my comfort zone, but we have to push ourselves from time to time. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking them.